Hi, welcome. Here's Sylvie Barbier and Rufus Pollock, and today we're in our episode 3 of Over the Mountains. And in the last episodes, we've kind of looked into how we're swimming into a free market ideology, and that is a foundation that has built a huge amount of inequality. And we were particularly interested of how come we got here. And one thing for me that really touched me was to see that, oh, most billionaires today are in tech. And how come that is? And so in our previous episode, we kind of touch upon the fact that um, what it has to do with the nature of digital technology, that it allows for costless copying. And that means we can reach planetary level, share information across the globe, which is amazing. And the fact that today we run that through a monopoly system, and that creates massive concentration of power. And that's how we're a bit in the social political situation we are today. And mostly today, I'd like to unfold and unpack a few more things with you in regards to this, both the ideology we're in, how that shapes our behavior, and some of the implication in certain domains of society. And for me, the key thing was also seeing how this affects philanthropy. Could you share a little bit more with us, in your experience with your career in open knowledge, how you saw that shape the philanthropic space?
Yeah, and we also want to talk about medicine, I guess, at one point as well.
Yes.
Should we come to that later?
Yes.
Okay. So, in terms of the philanthropic space, I think that there are several things to say. So, first of all, just the really obvious point that there are two main again, we should say we're talking more about the US as an exemplar of like maybe the most kind of developed form of either the system or even the disease, but it also happens in other countries. Philanthropy and government are obviously the kind of two major areas that are shaping kind of views and values and kind of action. And philanthropy, just to be clear, can include like all of the non-profit funding, even, and I'd even include some of the kind of politically oriented funding for think tanks and so on. So one thing is just that philanthropy is particularly in, in in the US is based on people who've made a lot of money. I mean, most philanthropy comes from people who've started foundations. Now, some of those are quite old. So, like, there's the Rockefeller Foundation, which comes out of the Rockefeller oil fortune at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And then there's the Ford Foundation, which comes from the Ford, motor company. But in recent times, obviously, much of the money has come from the two, I would say, preeminent businesses actually of the information age, which are finance and technology, digital tech, and or information technology to be more accurate. And so, like this on one side, you have like George Soros, who the Open Society Foundations. By the way, many of these foundations do amazing work. I'm not directly critiquing that, but Soros obviously made his money in finance. Actually, one of the major funders of Trump made his money at Renaissance Technologies, which was another trading firm. But in the tech area, you have a lot. You have the Hewlett Foundation, you have the Omidyar Network, you have, just many, many foundations. The Gates Foundation, which is basically the largest philanthropy in the world, created by Bill Gates and his wife. And there is a basic point about that about philanthropy, right? Which is that, or the people who are creating those philanthropies are, in a way, they've succeeded in the current system.
Mhm.
They are, and they're generally swimming in the ideology of that system. You generally want to think that your wealth has come about by legitimate means, by good means. It's like it's quite painful to think I've got really rich, but I did it by a way that's kind of illegitimate or bad. So there's this general human kind of tendency, cognitive dissonance tendency, to want to think that how that happened was good.
Mhm.
And in general, one of the underpinnings of the information, wealth, as we said, was there's costless copying. There's costless copying plus intellectual property monopoly rights, copyright and patents. And, like famously in the case, let's just take Gates, in the early era of the computer era, the early times, there was a lot of software sharing. Like basically people didn't even really think copyright may be applied to software. They certainly think that patents didn't apply to software. And in fact, they didn't for a long time. And so there's actually this early argument of like Bill Gates, I think at the Homebrew Computer Club in Silicon Valley, back in the 70s, where basically at that point people were like, well, you've written this basic interpreter, which was this, programming, well, this interpreter for programming language, and they were like passing it around on floppy disks. They were just making, or whatever the disks were at that point, not quite floppy disks. And this was the attitude. People remixed and reused other people's software. You shared it around. It was a world of sharing. And Gates was saying like, no, I've got copyright in this. I don't want you to share it. You got to buy it. And there was a lot of upset about that. But there's this aspect that these information empires were built on copyright.
Mm.
Now, the interesting point of that is less what that implies about what like Gates's philanthropy, for example, does in software. But let's say Gates Foundation has been a major player in healthcare, like international healthcare. It's like outside of government, it's probably one of the major funders of, you know, healthcare activity around the world. Hugely influential because of that in many areas. And obviously, is one of the big tensions over the last 25 years has been access to medicines. So particularly in the mid, I mean, this is now in a history, but in the mid 90s, there's this major trade reforms with the World Trade Organization. And one of the major new agreements that came in, there were basically three: GATT, and TRIPS. Now, GATT was about classic trade in like corn or steel. GATS was about trade in services. I'm selling accountancy services in another country from where I am. And TRIPS was about intellectual property, or it was about information goods, which includes, by the way, medicines. It's not just things that you think of as pure digital information, but most of a medicine is in the recipe, in the what is then patented, and so on. And TRIPS basically said everyone in the world who signs on to WTO, which is pretty much everyone who wants to trade, you need to have pretty strong intellectual property rules. And many countries did not. For example, India had not had patents on pharmaceuticals. India said it is wrong to patent, life-saving chemicals. We're going to let anyone produce them. And suddenly, all over the world, you had to implement strong patent protection like the US. And this was something that the US, and particularly US lobbying, had put into the WTO, basically. This was sort of the deal. Like India, you want access to US markets to sell whatever you want to sell, cloth, textiles, etc., or China. In exchange, you're going to give intellectual property, monopoly right protection to our information, goods that we're selling to you. And so this led to a lot of tension, particularly in the early 2000s and late 90s. There was the AIDS epidemic all over the world. So suddenly AIDS was exploding, particularly in many developing countries. And you were starting to have these breakthrough in AIDS drugs, HIV drugs, that really made a difference. They're particularly like this combination AZT, and these were being patented in the US. I mean, by the way, ironically, many of these drugs had been developed with public funding um,
Mm.
decades earlier, but they were being patented. And you had drugs that were selling for now thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, but which you could manufacture for $1 a day. Like there's this famous breakthrough in the early 2000s where it's like this headline in the New York Times, like we could provide AZT basically for $1 a day. There's this Indian generics pharmaceutical manufacturer, a really major manufacturer of pharmaceuticals, saying like we can do $1 a day of these drugs, and that would make them affordable in somewhere like South Africa, all over Africa, in Thailand, in Southeast Asia, which had major HIV epidemics, and we're talking millions of people,
Mm.
and they were clearly not affordable at the prices that were being sold or being asked by the major manufacturers and the patent holders mainly in the US and Europe. And of course, you know, one of the big advocates was like, you shouldn't, this patent protection was a mistake, or we should have much different patent protection, or have basically enforced licensing, like what would be called compulsory licensing, where you say, listen, yeah, you've got this patent, but it's an emergency in our country. We need to license it, to mass produce it because we've got a health emergency. And by the way, the US does do this. For example, when they had an anthrax scare about people sending anthrax through the mail, they immediately compulsory license drugs or do things. Sometimes this kind of stuff happens. But the US, of course, is saying, no, you can't do this. And of course, where would be Gates Foundation on this? Was Gates Foundation going to be funding, people out there, really act radically pushing for this kind of stuff? Of course not. And so there's been, I don't think this is something that you can explicitly point to. And I don't think it was a conscious thing of like the Gates Foundation or in general, but you're not going to have like the CEO of the Gates Foundation with Bill Gates on the board saying, we're going to take a really like, anti, patent stance, or like a radical stance of like, we should have a really different patent system. That's just not going to happen most of the time. And this kind of thing is, I think, subtly there throughout much of that kind of funding. You're not going to get funding for these kind of ideas that really challenge the system in general. What
Mm,
I would say is that you end up in the philanthropic industrial complex, you could say, because it is now pretty massive and pretty systematic in essentially funding amelioration to the system. You don't really question the system that's there. You ameliorate it. You build hospitals. You do education. You tend to use the tools that are already there for amelioration. So, oh yeah, we care about impact. If we now, at least in the West, we're very in favor of gender equality. So funding that kind of stuff will go. But things that really question, for example, capitalism, that really question growth narratives, that kind of question, maybe even in a deep way, the inequality that we have in the system, is much rarer. It's not to say that doesn't happen through some philanthropic organizations, and particularly there's the aspect that over time philanthropic organizations move away from their like founder or founding resource to become in a way more professionalized and bureaucratized, and often bureaucratized with people who have very progressive ideals. So there are shifts, but in general, you can see, and it's kind of the influence of ideology, of the worldview that we're in, and particularly of, I would say, Silicon Valley, digital tech mindset, efficiency, kind of evaluation, the power of technology in general. The example I think on a side is we ran an event at Harvard in the School of Education recently, and just looking at the endowed professorships in the School of Education. So this is another form of philanthropy, right? Of funding professorships in universities. I think almost all of the recent professorships in the School of Education were of like education and technology of some kind. And so you just see this influence kind of everywhere in the way that the ideology sort of spreads. And
mm,
the example I always felt, just to make it maybe a personal example, it's one of the people I most admired and influenced me at the Open Knowledge Foundation was someone called Jamie Love. Um, and Jamie Love was just an incredible figure in, I think, in this area. Like, he was like, I think, the pioneer really of seeing the the lobbying and then the lawmaking that was going on in the information age in the 90s and 2000s, and like almost not alone, but was certainly the pioneer. Like, he was going to Geneva, which is where a lot of these kind of laws get enacted, out, but almost invisible to the public in Geneva, and then then they come out of like international organizations like the World Intellectual Property Organization or the World WTO, and then they get enacted locally in legislation. So all of the major rules about how information would be governed happened in the mid to late 90s in
mm,
Geneva. And then they came back to the EU and the US and all the other countries. And he was there. And I don't know for sure, but I could pretty imagine that Jamie Love has never received any funding from the Gates Foundation. I would say he was one of this, he has probably saved through his work with others, and of course it's with many others, to save like millions of lives. I mean, he was one of the architects of the dollar a day effort to get access to medicines in Africa in the 2000s and elsewhere. and just was a complete pioneer of many of these things. And I think has always struggled to get funding. you know
Mm. And
so
I
yeah.
really wanted this to be brought up partially because, I think a lot of people, we see that there's still today a real problematic about access to medicine. There's also conspiracy theory around pharmaceuticals, and the people might not realize that what's underneath that is the laws that we have around information, around our market with information, that creates this um, huge inequality now not just in money but also in life, like who get access to live. And I think that's one of the dimension that I never thought when, when you think of open information, open data, you never think that open data, or at least for me, is related to meds, to people being able to afford life-saving medicine. And I remember when we worked on this project of IMED, of making people see that there's other ways that we can manage our information, so that it would not mean people dying from not being able to afford certain medicines. And I think it's particularly relevant in the US because they don't have as much health coverage as we have in Europe. But it's also this kind of real sense for me of like unfairness that both people paid for the R&D, like massive amount of the R&D is paid by the people through the government in university, and then a private enterprise comes make a little uh, uh, like also make some R&D, but like the comparison of the quantity of R&D they do is all built on the foundation of university, and then has this pattern, and then people die out of not being able to afford those drugs. Um, and I really sense that today people are fed up with this inequality. There's something deeply wrong that we know in our core being, that we can't continue on this trajectory. And also, I think it touches in the one of the ideological frame, I think, is also this belief of the American dream and meritocracy. And there's also a bit sometime I feel in the entrepreneur tech messaging that we're being sold, that if I'm rich is because in a way I deserve it through my hard work.
Yes.
Um, and I think it creates so much anger because, well, you can't say that the person who's a janitor, who's a single father raising two kids, who wakes up at 5 a.m. to clean the offices at 6 a.m. so that the workers, when they come in into their nice polished office by 9, looks spotless, is not working hard. And then again, clean, declogs the toilet. And there's that sense of like, yes, you might work hard. Yes, you might be a bit smarter than the average, but
Yes.
it does not justify, the gap between, people who make minimum wage and tech billionaires. There's nothing that can justify this level of inequality. And I think we have to like look at some of in the basically modernity ideology of merit, a part of which is meritocracy. It gets distorted. There's something beautiful of saying, work hard, you can do it. But like right now, it's like you work hard and some people barely survive, barely makes its end. And at the same time, you watch Instagram and you see those tech billionaires, and
Jeff Bezos coming into Cannes. Yeah.
yes, you can't access that level of wealth. There's nothing that justify that level of
Yes.
inequality. And I think this kind of there's something deeply crumbling there. Um, and yeah, I think particularly, I remember now a couple of years ago, I was taking the metro in Paris, and that was line 12. and line 12 goes from the north west of Paris into the center of like the very bourgeois upper middle class of Paris and down. And if at the top of the line, when you take the metro line at like 6 a.m., it's full of black people, colored people who come into Paris to do the work of cleaning the office. And as you go along, then it's more and more bourgeois white people. And that was very interesting to see like the shift of ethnicity depending on the hours of the days and the geographic of that metro line. And that at that time there was the office of WeWork. And I remember once going to WeWork with you and some friends. And WeWork tagline is like, I think, do what you love, something like that. And you'd have the janitor wear this t-shirt. And I'm like, do you really think the janitor who's like unclogging your toilet is doing what he loves? It's like, it was, and it was part of it. I'm sharing that story because it's part of this, like, oh, conquer the world, do what you love, and you can make it. And it's like,
Purpose bullshit. Yeah.
there's this kind of um yeah the this but it but even if it's not purpose, it's like, yeah, working class people are also working their ass off and they will never make billions washing toilets.
Yes.
Um,
Well, and what we're trying to do here is one is for people listening. I think this is a general sense now, but understand why that's happened and therefore what we can do about it. Because that it isn't what we're also trying to explain here is while, tax policy, for example, and one way to address this is to tax the ultra rich differently. That's not really the underlying engine of what's been happening. I mean, the metaphor I have to go back to the apple farmer is, or let's say it's something else where um, it, it, one other way to think about this is running a race, right? And in one world, we run a race, and that's like being an apple farmer or whatever job we're doing. And some people are slightly better at running or they train harder. And basically, though, the distribution of kind of prizes is fairly equal. There is a difference between being a really good apple farmer and a not so good apple farmer, but it's not huge. And then you move to a world where basically all the resources goes to the winner.
mm,
Now,
mm,
there
mm.
might still be a really small, relatively small difference between the winner and everyone else, but now all the resources go to them.
Yes.
And this is essentially what happens when you have costless copying. Because in the old world, however good the Mess Apple farmer was, they couldn't supply everybody. You couldn't get everything from that person. Now, that's even being too generous to how like that their skill or their ability. If you imagine it was even just random, like you're going into a casino and you're given lottery tickets, and someone just gets the lucky lottery ticket, we wouldn't think it was very just that they get all the wealth and no one else gets anything. And that's largely what digital technology is. You look at Facebook, there were like multiple social networking startups, right, that happened at that time. Like multiple, many people had the idea that was going to be important. There were a variety of that happened. And, maybe Facebook was run a bit better. Maybe it was a bit more ruthless. Who knows? Maybe it was just lucky that it worked out that starting out in universities, like, was a really good idea. I even went to university 5 years earlier than that, and we were doing a table of faces, what was basically a Facebook at my university, but no one, it was too early to put it properly online and do it. We all have all these things, and it just someone ends up as the winner for the reason we discussed about costless copying and platform effects. And combined with monopoly rights, that person is a monopolist. So not only
Yeah.
is there one, they own and control it. And the thing to understand then is what we can do things about that. And as you said, the ultimate inequality is in medicines, where we have a world where the inequality is life or death, where
Yeah.
if you can afford coverage or not. And I think it's amazing to think that one of the major US hit series of the last 20 years was Breaking Bad. And the school teacher at the beginning of that is quite moving at me. I mean, he's a kind of middle class, lower middle class guy. I guess, yeah, he's a high school teacher, and he can't afford basically his cancer treatment, and that that's not unusual in the US. And this is the case certainly. you have these many examples now where this is happening, and where the irony is we don't actually need what the way we've been running the pharmaceutical system to even fund the innovation to have it, I would say. So we can come to that. But just say, yeah, there
Yes.
is this outrage, and I think right outrage about the inequality we've had. And but the way that you're saying the ideology that we're often all swimming in is used to justify it. For people
Yes. It's
logistical.
like we use now meritocracy to justify this level of inequality. And I'm like,
But no one thinks that about going to a casino. No one would think, oh, you went to a casino. And even if you were a slightly better blackjack player than someone else, it's mostly luck or poker player. It's like there's a lot of luck involved. And I think that's one of the things we've had. And, my point is that the analogy I think that people can really get is to say, listen, um, think of tournament professions in general. Like, can you name the 65th best tennis player in the world? No one can name that, right? But you maybe know the number one. So think of the distribution of wealth for tennis. Now, the 65th tennis player is probably not that. I mean, they're the 65th best tennis player in the world out of like 8 billion people. So they're pretty good at tennis. And they're probably not that much. They're probably a tiny bit less good than the number one. Like relative to everyone else in the world, there's like a really tiny differential. And they maybe train as hard, they practice hard. There's a tiny bit of talent or something else. Or even compare the number one with the number 20. Probably the number one or the number, if you're in the number one, number two spot, you probably get 10 to 100 times more money than the number 20 gets. And the number
mm-mm,
100 tennis player in the world barely makes a living, probably,
mm-mm.
as a professional tennis player. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's number 300. But my point is just, as you move from the apple farmer world, where the number 1,000th apple farm in the world and the number one apple farm in the world probably is pretty close in how much money they make. And there's this people make money a long way out, the apple farmer. You move to this world where there's basically a winner, and that winner takes everything.
Yes,
And is that fair?
probably,
Is that
and
is that a world that works for people? Not really.
and I think what I'm trying to illustrate is how much information runs everywhere today. It's like it touches pharma, but it also touches agriculture because like there's modification of crops and like people have to pay for that. Like that information goes into fashion and branding because what is sold in fashion today is not just the material, is actually now a lot the branding, the story, the narrative, which is information. Um, it touches, you know, so why the design industry is also booming is like design is information. It's like so much of the value of our world has shifted into information. Um, and I mean, we will kind of open that conversation with our colleague Liam. But what I liked about what Liam was pointing into, like, well, we know that capitalism is imperfect as a system because basically the professions that generate the most value in our society are not the most paid. That actually firemen, doctors, um, nurses, school teachers, if it was a system that reflected what really mattered, these profession would be the one who are most paid. Or whereas today there are actually some of not all, but like quite poorly paid.
Yes.
But I think at first we're setting up a little bit the critique so that people realize how much the system, the rules we've created are grounded into an ideology. And actually, at the root of this ideology is really like a deeper layer of this kind of like what we touch about the free market ideology that's been pushed forward, and also Christian evangelical ideology has been put forward. Deeper in our roots is an ideology of modernity.
Yes. And so you want to see the sequence here, which is there are rules our society runs on, right? Well, I didn't even start at the top now. There's symptoms that you see, like Jeff Bezos going into Cannes on a yacht, burning 600 barrels of oil a day with his girlfriend, then wife. That's the thing. You're like, oh my God, this is kind of like crazy. Like, how come we have this kind of these techno kings of the modern day? Below that, then are the rules that we said. So there's this, well, there's two pack. There's the physical fact of costless copying and the kind of platform effects. Combined, though, most importantly, with human created rules, the laws, the fact that we give out copyright and patents in the way we do. And we could do it very differently than that. We could, there's, I'll come to that. But my point is that we have set some rules. Then below that are basically politics and collective action. So those rules got made somewhere. There were meetings, there were, in theory, democratically elected governments and some
Yeah.
non-democratic
And
governments.
can I speak a little bit to that before
Can I
you
spit?
finish your point? No, 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 I want to come into that because one of the things we mentioned is that yes, there are those rules and collective action problem, and we're also set to believe that there cannot be other rules that function.
Yes.
And that's
Well,
really important. And the lack of political activism in our youth and involvement is very embedded in the fact that we don't believe that we can change the rules, that there are better rules, that there are better policy. And then you were gonna go into
that's
like
what
actually
so
underneath there's another layer.
underneath is politics and collective action. But you kind of said it for me, which is fantastic, which is like, so there's the symptoms, then there's the actual rules, then there's how the rules get set, as I said, in politics, but which requires collective action. It requires groups coming together. In fact, big business, various parts of big business, especially the pharmaceutical industry, the movie industry, were very active in lobbying. There's a theory, interest groups, or even just the general citizens who can vote for their politicians. That's the level below of politics and collective action. And that itself sits within the frame of our worldviews and assumptions and beliefs. And as you just identified, so two of those that were really informing what went on in terms of the rules was what rules are even possible. So the most brilliant thing of all is not to even have to have a fight, like to win in a debate between groups of interest groups, or like some debate over what we should do, but to frame the entire debate. So it's not even on the table that you can be this way. It's communism to not have free enterprise. You're like, but wait a moment, you know, India didn't have patents on drugs. In fact, the US didn't have copyright in books from foreign countries until the 18, I think, 70s or something like that. So, but there's this kind of way that ideology makes us even frame things. And then there's also the way that ideology frames political action. So if it's like, well, the only way to do stuff is for individual self-enterprise and the market, we don't get engaged in politics. We disengage from politics. So there's this double way in which the underlying kind of cultural frame that we are in, the water the fish is swimming in, frame both the options that are on the table and our way of engaging in the political process of making the rules. And that's been phenomenally powerful. And that was what went back to our first episode here, where we were saying that, what was amazing to me is seeing kind of like basically progressive, people, progressive young, you know, activists in politics that I was seeing of a kind, but who are tech oriented in the 2000s and 2010s, they don't consider going and actually getting engaged in classic politics and collective action or doing the rules. They're like, well, I'll build an app. That's the way we'll change the world. And not even realizing that in a way they are inside the matrix that's been created by this kind of these efforts over the last 50 years to kind of channel their efforts into an area that ultimately isn't really so effective and certainly doesn't endanger the system. In
Hmm.
the same way, in a very subtle way, the Gates Foundation will say we care a lot about healthcare, but our way to deal with this healthcare crisis, or like this HIV crisis, is to get the US government and other people to spend lots of money to buy drugs to give
Hmm.
to people. It's not to change the underlying system of how drugs are produced.
Hmm.
Do you see? Like we channel
Yeah.
our efforts in a certain area that, and without even seeing that we're being blind, we're kind of blinded to other possibilities.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I hope that allows people to kind of understand the underlying currents into how we are in this kind of polycrisis today. And stay in touch because more episode to come. We will probably cover, capitalism, how we can go beyond capitalism. what are the roots of the capitalistic ideology. And thank you so much for listening to us to Over the Mountains.
Thank you. Until next time.